the application of it really, as we talked about it, came down to your doctors are using AI. Why aren't you? And we're going to speak to that in a moment. Nathan, actually, I'm going to just set you up briefly and say a little bit about our new partnership. But Nathan Chappell is a senior vice president at DonorSearch Aristotle. He is the genius behind a lot of their AI work, and he has some great background as an online fundraiser as well. And so, as Marts&Lundy and DonorSearch Aristotle decided to look at how the use of data for great prospect identification and management was evolving. These were the best partners that were out there doing the most progressive things. And so, Nathan, with that, I'd like to ask you just to give a little bit more of your background, and then we can leap into it.
Sure. Yeah. Welcome, or thank you. Thank you for welcoming me this morning. I'm calling in from Park City on the last day of my vacation with 12 inches of snow on the slopes right now. So I kicked my family out the door, and they're heading out for a day of skiing. I'll join up with them in a little bit, but forgive my absence of a suit and tie. I just couldn't pack it with me on this trip. But it is a privilege and a pleasure to be here today. As way background, I've spent 20 years, so not the 30 years Frank has, but 20 years in the nonprofit side. I was associate vice chancellor at UC San Diego, where I led a pretty large team, including their $2 billion campaign, and then served as senior vice president at City of Hope. For those that are west of the Mississippi, it's one of the founding members of the NCI Cancer Network, where I led a pretty large team there and did a lot of great work, including the development of the first AI machine learning algorithms to help predict which patients were most likely to give. So the work that we're going to present today is really about 5 years in the making, from the time where I was in the fundraising seat, trying to figure out how do we take all this data and make sense of it, and then how do we wrap processes around it to make it actionable. So I think what we have today is actually a really exciting presentation. It's certainly probably better than what was on the agenda, as Frank said. And just for note, in terms of healthcare, actually healthcare is the largest investment of AI of any other sector. So doctors are using AI. They're extremely familiar with the concepts of machine learning and deep learning, because precision medicine has completely revolutionized how medicine is delivered and will continue. So it does make a lot of sense that the philanthropy efforts will be following suit in that regard. And then on the children's hospital side, I'll just one quick note. I actually serve as counsel at my local children's hospital, which is in Orange County, California, CHOC. And so I am, and I have for several years, I'm very familiar with the nuances of children's hospitals and the things that are different and the things that are special and things that make them special. So we love being here, kind of putting our heads together and sharing what we think is a new kind of best-in-class process that all hospitals can use, but specifically children's hospitals. I guess I can continue to riff on that just a little bit, and then Frank will tie this up. Really, this slide represents this idea that data for data's sake is of no use, or processes without data are really of very little use. And it's this idea that we as industries have excelled in one or two of these domains, but really this partnership at with Marts&Lundy and DonorSearch represents really the best in class from data and analytics and having real-time access to data and making decisions on that, with best in class consulting and training and processes. So everything that we've designed today is to really guide through this conversation. This is not a presentation that you've heard in the past where it's like, oh, this one firm does this one thing really, really well, and now we have to figure out, what are all the other missing elements. This is essentially really trying to become this holistic one-stop shop for all of the best in breed, if you will, in terms of grateful family philanthropy within children's hospitals. Frank?
And Nathan, I would just amplify a little bit of what you said, but there are the fundamentals, which we all know in terms of organizing our programs, working effectively with physicians. I spend a great deal of my time working around the country on training of physicians and other healthcare providers in how to work with development, make effective referrals, what to listen for. We're going to talk a little bit later about gratitude and its importance, as you all well know. But the pairing with what Aristotle is doing here was something that I'd been looking for 30 years in the profession. That we've always had ways of examining data, but nothing that's been this dynamic or this usable, I think. And when you couple that with taking a very good, hard, honest look at what are our programs like, do we need to evolve those as the information evolves so we can be effective and efficient? I think that's where the synergy between these two gets very exciting.
Yeah, so we'll just level set here a little bit of why this even matters. And, the fact that this entire approach was built in a healthcare environment where we had lots of data, and philanthropy was not just a luxury, but something that was needed by hospitals. So, and when we're talking about philanthropy can account for 20% of a hospital's bottom line, we're talking about, true from an EBITDA perspective. So true profit to the hospital. It's, as Frank, has worked with hospitals all over the country, and so have seen that, philanthropy in many hospitals is that margin of excellence. It's that, the funds that are needed to, advance cures more quickly or provide services to patients that they couldn't do otherwise. And this idea is, that philanthropy is important, and the work that the foundations do for those hospitals needs to be as most efficient as it possibly can so that it can provide the greatest benefit. At the same time, we look at, and this is not from us, this is from advisory board, that 88% of major gifts to hospitals come from patients or their families. So of course, especially children's hospitals have a lot of success raising money in the broader community and through events and of all different scales and size. Those large gifts as principal and transformative gifts, and a majority of those major gifts are coming from people who know you intimately from the clinical setting and that have experienced the hospital in meaningful ways. It turns out, not surprisingly, that when we're looking at this from a data science perspective, it's the quantity of those touch points in different forms and fashion of whether it's inpatient or outpatient and by department, that people build those strong bonds with hospitals. And it's just an incredible opportunity, and too few hospitals use that data to build out their practices. And then the last part, and this is definitely preaching to the choir, but it's always something that's nice to be reminded of, is that we, in terms of fundraising in healthcare settings, we are part of the continuum of care. The idea, of course, and there's lots of studies that show this, that the act of giving and the act of generosity has almost the same effect as taking medication to lower blood pressure or decrease depression. So this idea, to take that a step further, is that essentially people that give are happier, and people that are happier have better clinical outcomes. So this idea of the foundation not being a separate part of the mission of the hospital, but being very much in concert with that continuum of care, that everyone is working together toward the same goal, is to make your patients and patients healthy and your families whole. And so that's just the nice complement that we add. And as we think about these best practices, we have to make sure that what we're recommending would support all of those tenets of positive, grateful family philanthropy.
Thanks, Nathan. And I think I would just add to that if you're not familiar with Dr. Robert Emmons, who's at UC Davis, he's sort of the guru of gratitude. He's a psychiatrist there who's published a number of academic papers and talks about the positive effects of gratitude. So, sometimes in speaking with physicians and scientists, you need to reference physicians and scientists to be more credible. And Dr. Emmons is a great source. And Nathan, you spoke very well to the point. And as I mentioned, we often assume that physicians and care providers know this and know that gratitude and philanthropy benefit families and patients as well. It's not always a given, and I think we all find that in our everyday work. Turning to just what do the characteristics of a successful, grateful giving program in philanthropy look like? I like to step back and think that, first and foremost, it's really about promoting a culture of gratitude in your institution, starting right from the top down. Sometimes this is much more prominent in children's hospitals, and it looks broader. It's a lot of community involvement, a lot of family involvement. But it doesn't necessarily percolate through all levels of staff, administration. So always promoting that broader culture of gratitude through your work is going to be essential. Engaging and educating clinical staff. I've sort of touched on that, but it's interesting that when I was at the University of Rochester Medical Center, we actually worked with Marts&Lundy at the time to develop a program to consistently train cohorts of providers, starting with physicians, but nurses and others as well, in making sure they understood what development was, what the impact of the Foundation of Philanthropy could be, what it did for patients, what the roles was, how they could be engaged. And that's an ongoing process. I think what we found was when we tried doing sort of one and done training, it was quickly forgotten. So there's a degree of discipline to all of this that makes it work, including continuing education of the development staff and staff training. When we engineer training programs with clients, and they all look different, but a constant element is we train development staff alongside physicians in every session, so that we make sure they have a common language and that they understand the same basic tenets, they can practice the same sorts of things. And there needs to be discipline management process behind it. What are the indicators, the key performance indicators of success? How are you managing to those? What's your management process? I recently did a feasibility study and had a donor say to me that trust is built upon shared success. And as I thought about that, and the consistency that you need to build trust with physicians, with administration, with patients and families, it really is about repeatable process and your consistency in the program. In terms of follow-up and in terms of communication. Again, these are things that but often bear repeating, because it's we go into programs where it's not a given that there's the discipline around process that helps make these things work.
Yeah, and that's so true, especially when we're going to start talking about data, because again, providing data, even the best data for data's sake, it's not going to get you really anywhere other than feeling like you have good data. So this idea, and again, this idea of best practices and grateful philanthropy is agnostic to Marts&Lundy or DonorSearch. This is just what, as professionals that we get to work with hospitals all over the country, we see. For sure, one of those elements is that the best practice programs are able to use their CRM and EMR data. And it's so common for hospitals and foundation relationships, especially with children's hospitals, to say, well, we don't have access to the EMR data because we're a separate foundation. But HIPAA for fundraising is very clear on what can and cannot be used. In fact, we have an interesting situation at Chalk in Orange County that the foundation is allowed to use the EMR data in their algorithm, but the foundation's not allowed to access or see the data, the EMR data. So there's lots of ways to structure this. And I always tell our clients and prospective clients, even if you don't hire us, let us help you get access to your data. It's one of the big first steps to you building out a more modern day grateful philanthropy program. The second piece is really this idea around something that you probably talked about for a long time, but it's not been really probably a best practice until now, is this idea of diversified and dynamic portfolios. Diversified meaning if you have portfolios full of, frankly, rich white men, it's only going to get you so far. And not good for a variety of reasons that we could talk another hour about on the ethics and equality issue around fundraising. The dynamic piece is really this idea that if you believe that patients are on a journey and donors are on a journey, that no person is either a donor or a prospect. They are a person that knows the hospital to some extent and every day has a choice or opportunity to get more involved in the hospital or less involved. So this idea that your donors and your patients are on a journey, your practice has to follow that as well, so that your portfolio should be fluid, always moving. people in and people out, people up and people down. This is a major change in most fundraising programs because of what we're going to show you in just a few minutes that actually allows for that. The other piece of this is allowing or making data actionable or accessible for the whole department. So not just one person that you hire as a head of prospect development that holds all the keys and only is just reactive in providing information when asked, but that data has a seat at the table, that you have a person that is part of strategy, whether it's a campaign or your major gift meetings or principal gift meetings, that you have a person that represents all of your actionable insights that is there to help provide strategy. That's a big, big change. 10 years ago, that never happened. In the last few years, we see a lot of recruiters hiring for people that understand how to make data actionable and to have a senior level role at the table to help make sure that that's part of the strategy. And then the last is that, again, back to no one is a donor or a prospect. A person is someone who interfaces with the hospital in unique ways. And someone that interfaces with the hospital in a cardiovascular way is very different than an oncology way. And so having different strategies based on different departments and different providers is absolutely key for this idea of precision philanthropy, if you will, for this idea that the philanthropy is very personal to the individual, just like anyone that is seeking care, their disease is personal to them. Go to the next slide, Frank.
Working on it.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Frank.
Well, I was just going to say that this is a little bit of a summary slide because you touched on some of the points, but the real-time speed of being able to refresh this data, the pinpoint accuracy of it based on each individual's experience, either as a donor or not a donor, really helps. The best-in-class programs are really looking at being very patient and donor-centric, which is also what your clinicians strive for as well. But as you use this dynamic information to target your activity better, you wind up with better starting points in your relationships. And so I think it winds up being not only efficient and effective, but a little more resonant on a human level as well.
Yeah, and I would say out of this whole list, and these really are the benefits that we see, hospitals that use a more holistic strategy around identifying which patient prospects are most likely to give, have repeatable processes with their Grateful Family program. They are able to benefit from a lot of those things. The two that really stand out for me and should for you as well is the one Frank was just talking about, speed. The advisory board also did a study that waiting from 1 month to 3 months to solicitation, we'll see a 21% decline in giving. So this idea of speed matters, or the tears of gratitude dry quickly, it proves itself out mathematically every time. So having access, not just access to data, but having insights in real time have a really, really big application. And the second is accuracy, because hospitals are incredible places to do fundraising, but they have this dilemma in that they have so much data. There's so many patients that come in. How do you look at those patients on a daily basis? And as we look across all of our clients, about 1% to 2% of patients convert to becoming donors. So it's a bit of a needle in the haystack situation. So how do you address the speed and the accuracy kind of equation and benefit from both of those things, while at the same time reducing bias and making your fundraising more holistic, making sure that they're transparent so that you'd be above reproach in your fundraising efforts. You're being dynamic and tracking patients and their donor journey in real time, and doing this all in one kind of central kind of repository, a fully integrated solution from end to end. This is essentially what we're talking about today. So moving away, and I know the Marts&Lundy team, we've been able to share this slide. It's just not revolutionary by any stretch, but I think it's one of those ahas that a lot of people see. As I was in the fundraising seat for 20 years, buying models from pretty much every company out there that sells them, I realized that those models could be good at finding my existing donors and reprioritizing. and essentially moving the chairs on the deck, and this idea of feeling like you're going back to the well, especially back to a campaign. It's like we're just going back to the well. It's because every model on the market that we had ever bought and used essentially just takes two data sets. They take wealth data and they take giving data. And what those models are doing, for the last 30 to 40 years, are essentially just reprioritizing your wealthiest donors. And essentially at the same time, they're penalizing any person who has not made a donation. So this idea that you might have very engaged patients and patient families and volunteering and attending events and opening up emails and things like that, but they haven't made a gift. So essentially are being penalized because they're being scored against these existing donors. We've taken a completely different approach with our DonorSearch Aristotle, and it's a much more patient-centric or holistic approach in that we found very early on in our testing at City of Hope that experiential data, so the quantity of visits in the hospital, whether it was inpatient or outpatient, volunteerism, event attendance, opening emails, those are about 80% indicative of a person's not just desire to give, but the likelihood they're going to give versus the fact that they've given before. And it's worth pointing out is that the conditions that exist of non-donors that make their first gift from a data science perspective are different than donors that are making repeat gifts because they already know you more intimately, and it becomes more about how you're stewarding that relationship and those gifts. So the DonorSearch Aristotle platform is built on this holistic idea, and really the Marts&Lundy partnership is built on the same idea, is looking at patients and their families holistically by not just their giving patterns or their wealth or what's in their pocketbook, but it's about all the data that we can get our arms around, and in which case most of the models that we build now for hospitals use around 500 to 1,000 data points per person versus what has been historically done in our industry, which is how wealthy are you and have you given before?
And I think, Nathan, to that point, it's that, this is a much stronger starting point for building engagement or relationships, whether you're a major gift officer, an annual fund officer, planned giving. So it's a great way to effectively narrow the target that we didn't have before. And we've actually touched on a number of these points already, so I just might, Nathan, if you don't mind, I'm just going to skip to the last.
Yeah, sorry, I jumped the gun. I forgot.
No, that's one of the reasons I love working with Nathan is he is excited about what he's doing. It's wonderful. But we talked about the timeliness and the ability to be efficient with all that data. The other point that continually needs to be made to every administration that I've ever worked with is that advancement, as wonderful as it is, foundation development, whatever you're called, is a limited resource and a very precious resource in terms of staff time, in terms of how many prospects you can effectively cover, in terms of the resources and how you solicit in a broad-based fashion. So I think this approach to data, there's also an ROI and a return on investment argument that's very strong, and it helps you find the actionable insights in the data that otherwise were pretty hard to pick out.
Yeah.
So with that, Nathan, I'll let you delve in a little deeper to the donor non-donor thing.
Yeah. So how do we do it? Essentially, this is where truly there's no other time in history that this type of work could have been done. Frankly, the advances in what the portion of AI is called deep learning have been so significant in the last 5 to 10 years, and really in the last 5 years, to allow making them more affordable, that prior to today, the only ones that could afford to do this approach would have been Microsoft or Google or AWS themselves. So what this graph represents essentially is a pure data science approach of looking at two different categories of individuals: donors on one side and non-donors on the other side. We found out through a lot of testing that, again, this idea that the variables that exist that convert essentially non-donors, or that are present when non-donors make their first gift, are very different than the same variables that are present when donors make gifts. But what we do from a data science perspective is, by separating out donors and non-donors, We take all the data we could get our hands on. We have EMR data and CRM data, event activity. It could be email marketing activity, like opening emails. And it can be on the EMR side, it would be the number of appointments, not just the number of appointments, but whether or not they were inpatient or outpatient, which department and which clinician. All those variables are very accessible clearly in HIPAA for fundraising guidelines. Different ways of getting that data, that's a different conversation. And like I shared with Chalk, they don't have access to the raw data, but we can use the EMR data and algorithms. But essentially what deep learning is able to do is to take every data point it can get its hands on. And by the way, we actually take all of the data we can get from a client and we wrap around 850 data points that DonorSearch has, which includes charitable giving data to other organizations, which helps us identify if this person is philanthropic to begin with. And it can be consumer data and demographic data. So once all the data exists or is put together, we essentially build a profile and the characteristic of what every donor has in common with one another. And then we're able to essentially score every patient forever on from that point as, does this person look like a donor that's likely to give another gift? And we do this, what's called a time series. We build a model that predicts not just that someone will make another gift, but they'll make another gift within a 12-month period. And that's for the donors. And essentially these models score every person from 0 to 100. The higher the score, we call it the Aristotle score. The higher the score, the more confident the model is, or the more characteristics this donor has with other donors that are likely to make another gift. And then the other part that is really revolutionary in this sector is doing the same thing, but for non-donors. Essentially quantifying every single attribute to 1,000 different calculations per person to determine how likely is this non-donor, how engaged are they essentially, how likely are they to make their first gift. And those individuals are also provided a score from 0 to 100. This approach of separating donors and non-donors might seem trivial just at face value, but no one in our industry has done this for 40 years, frankly, because they didn't understand the data scientist. And if they did, the cost was so prohibitive to be able to score them separately. You would just put everyone in a mush pot and give everyone a score. And essentially that score would be what would be considered static. The real second advantage of the advances in deep learning are these models are living kind of organisms, if you will. These algorithms get better over time. And you know this because you most likely buy things from Amazon, and you've been buying things from Amazon for many, many years. The base algorithm that Amazon used when it started out in 1996 and was recommending which books to buy is the same base algorithm that they use today. It's just been fed a lot more data over time where it's learned about your specific buying habits, to the point that Amazon will start shipping items to you before you actually hit the buy button when it's confident enough that you're actually going to follow that purchase. And so this idea of especially in hospitals, having lots of data to continue to feed these models day in and day out, because you have new patients every day and you have events and emails and other data that changes over time, that your model should change as well. So this idea of getting much more accurate results using deep learning is one side. And then the other side is being able to do that and refresh and refine these models over time. It's really a whole new era of precision philanthropy that's never been available before.
I really hate following that slide. I'm sorry, I seem to have sticky keys here, so.
You might have to click on the slide and then use the arrow. Sometimes it.
Okay, see the tech guy, he knows.
Yeah, that's really.
So it's interesting. So and as we look at the excitement of sort of this new way of looking at things, I'm the one that keeps bringing it back to, but this has to fit within the context of what you do more broadly. That opening point of the data by itself won't do anything, nor will the infrastructure, the development infrastructure by itself do anything. So, it's part of the strategy where you really need to have these four elements in place. starting right with a commitment from leadership, your CEO, your president on down, in terms of visible endorsement, in terms of budget, in terms of their support of your work with donors. Training we've touched on and talked about, not one and done, but something continuous, refreshed just the same way that your data will continuously be refreshed. Certainly the what we've talked about in terms of applying some sort of robust data analysis, whether it's Aristotle or something else, although there's nothing that I've seen quite like Aristotle. And lastly, and again, preaching to the choir, but without operational excellence, this falls apart very quickly because you lose credibility with your physicians, with your care providers. So this is where you need to have the staff, the processes, the management discipline to make sure that you can move forward with all this great information. We're all familiar with this one, the two-sided coin of both wealth and likelihood that we look at, dividing donors into quadrants and deciding where to spend our time. The wonderful thing about the model is that it's true, and it's been true for a long time. The way we need to work with the model is different because this is static. In the old days, this was a binder that went on the shelf and maybe got looked at again. In more recent times, it's a code that went on the system, and maybe we remember to use it sometimes. But continuing to work within the paradigm makes sense, but we need to modernize it.
I just have to take myself off mute there. Yeah, and so this idea of this, kind of best-in-class philosophical approach of, separating out individuals from both their likelihood and wealth. And I used to work at CCS, and we used very similar in Marts&Lundy, and every other consulting firm really believes in that process. It's not hard to get behind that. But really, up until now, there's never been really the technology available to do this in real time, to essentially look at people on the axis of likelihood on the y-axis and wealth on the x-axis, and on an ongoing basis, almost day by day or week by week basis, essentially track not only the likelihood that someone will make a gift, a donor will make a repeat gift, or a non-donor will make their first gift, but also tracking their wealth and their charitable giving to other organizations as well. We built our entire tool, in fact, our entire business, kind of the premise of our business is around essentially solving for what that graph represents. And this is just a screenshot of the DonorSearch Aristotle tool, which we've heard from people that have been longtime professionals with Mayo and large organizations. And Marts&Lundy's approach to this was the same, is that this fits and kind of solves for this idea that while we believe in these processes and we believe in this idea, without being able to do this with any sort of AI would just not be practical. We've made this tool extremely easy to use. And really it comes down to this idea of imagining a time when your gift officers meet with clinicians and they never bring a list of wealthy people to them again. Because that idea, reinforcing this idea that philanthropy is about being wealthy, really is something that our industry is challenged with and has been challenged with for a long time, and something that always bothered me when I was in the seat. But really this idea of building out practices with best processes and training, where gift officers go to clinicians with lists of individuals that are engaged, that through data science and through precision philanthropy, we can prove that they're likely to make a gift because they've experienced a hospital in meaningful ways. That's really what this comes down to. So it's really the perfect complement between using data science to surface those individuals and using the training and the practices and the leadership to essentially make those processes repeatable.
And I think at the end of the day, it's really coupling those insights that you gain from artificial intelligence and applying it to whatever your structure and approach is now. And having repeatable process in every aspect of your operation, going all the way from annual giving through major gifts, planned giving, as Nathan was just saying, how you work with physicians and referral and engagement. you want to take a look at your current processes, your current structure. You may need to redesign staffing, job descriptions, configurations, responsibilities based on a more vigorous approach to the data. So I think there's a wide world of possibilities. It will be different for every institution, but we're very excited about the juncture that we're at, both in this partnership and what we're going to be able to do going forward in helping people maximize philanthropy.